Our Speaker has been involved. Our Speaker has been involved in many highly publicized cases. He has defended Patty Hearst, the Boston Strangler, the Union Carbide Bhopal victims, and Dr. Sam Shepard, among others. In addition to his legal prowess, our Speaker is a distinguished author. He has written 17 books, including The Defense Never Rests and How to Protect Yourself Against Cops in California and Other Strange Places. Because of a grant from Elizabeth and Floyd Gottwald and the Student Campaign for Prominence, the Speaker's Board is proudly able to present to you tonight Mr. F. Lee Bailey.
Thank you. This is once again a season in which promises are offered at bargain rates, because a lot of people are trying to hold on to their jobs, which requires your vote. In the first week of September, U.S. News and World Report ran an extensive survey to see what it really is that concerns America most. Was it the disintegration of nuclear plants like 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl? Was it the plight of the farmers? Was it the imbalance of trade, interest rates, or whatever? The top of the list was the use of drugs in America. 86% thought that that was the biggest problem we had, the abuse of drugs, I should say. And 84% thought that crime in general should be addressed. It did not take the political world long to climb upon that signal. Congress immediately rushed in, some congressmen almost breaking both ankles, trying to get in and vote to, despite Graham-Rudman and other financial constraints, pass a bill, or at least sponsor one and send it to the Senate, which would pour huge quantities of money on the drug problem. The Republicans claimed that this was their effort to help Paula Hawkins squeak out of a rather lopsided set of polls in Florida and hang on to her job so the president could get some more Supreme Court justices approved during his last 2 years, which may be a problem if he doesn't hold that majority. Others said it was a newly discovered concern about crime in America. And sadly, I must tell you that's all nonsense. It is unfortunate that in order to address a problem of this gravity in the United States, one must go through the political vehicle. The political vehicle is often disabled to do what it knows it should do for reasons that it considers to be, quote, political. A good example was the Supreme Court decision which upset the whole country. I was living in North Carolina at the time, and they were especially upset, called Brown against the Board of Education in 1954. Perhaps the Congress should have long before that passed a law stressing equality, but it was only after the Supreme Court came down with the decision and then in 12 years began to hammer it home a little bit that it became fashionable to think of legislation that supported equality, and so on down the line. Now, there's plenty of popular support for crime control, but the manner in which it will be done does not have the popular support that it needs to get through. For all of my years watching crime in the United States, which is now 32, that's the length of time plus a few months that I have been trying criminal cases, first in the military and then in the civilian sector in every state in this union except Montana, in all military courts in all services, and in most federal courts, there has not been much progress. The time-tested remedies, the tests showing in each case generally that a failure sets in, are sold to the American public at election time with regularity. That is because the American public, being one of the most naive of the cultures on the earth today, we think that we're 200 years old. To the rest of the world, that makes us toddlers. Generally has the attention span of a 4-year-old. The nice thing about that is if you sell something and it doesn't work, wait a while and you can sell it again. And we are being told on a daily basis, and about to be told with greater vehemence leading up to the crescendo that is November 3rd, that if we will pour more money into the problem, get more prisons, fewer lawyers, more judges, tougher sentences, and so forth, that there will be less crime. Unfortunately, the people that are telling you this neither personally know any criminals, nor have they taken the time to make the acquaintance of anyone who does. I happen to be a great fan of Judge William Webster, who some years ago took over an FBI that many thought, me included, was in a shambles for a number of reasons, and put some of the polish back into it. But Judge Webster has been a federal judge and the head of the FBI, and not a person likely to be able to sit down and break bread or share a scotch and water with somebody who robs banks for a living. My clients personally don't know him and don't want to. Same is true of the head of the Chiefs of Police Association, Ed Meese, who was basically a cop who was made Attorney General when nobody was looking. He still wears white socks when he's not testifying before the Congress. And although they all have ideas, they are not based on the kind of analytical information that leads to the solution of ideas. Now, somewhere in your academic learning, within the hallowed walls, I will assume that someone has pointed out to you that in order to make judgments, it's helpful to be informed. If you can get some information, have time to digest it, sort it out, analyze it, try and figure out what it means, you may be in a position to construct an hypothesis. Then you try it out. If it doesn't work, you go back and construct another one. If it begins to work, it becomes a theory. If it works all the time, it becomes a principle, and then you can bank on it. But merely flying in the face of history has never won anyone anything. Now, there is a way not to eliminate crime. You will never do that without changing the human animal, the societies, the ghettos, and the other things that will produce criminals out of perfectly healthy people. But the way to diminish it very sharply is to take a look not at the courts and the lawyers and the sentences. That's only part of the mop-up. That's like tough sentences for drunk drivers. I think it's a very good idea. It'll deter some. It does not save the child who even at this moment is being killed in some major city by a drunk driver. In order to prevent an occurrence, you must address the problem in a different fashion than simply being remedial and retributive and bringing punishment. In the case of the drunk, the more drunk he gets, the more capable he thinks he is, and the more able to drive the car. Although during the daytime he may be a perfectly normal banker who lives a Christian life. Criminals are not quite that way. First of all, they don't come in the same suits. Most of the remedies that we have seen handed down by legislatures, occasionally modified by courts, kind of look at the criminal population as if you could address it with a single remedy. That makes no more sense than having a doctor come into town and announce that he gives Tylenol for everything from brain cancer to ingrown toenails. Most of you wouldn't go to him. You know better than that. What you don't know is that we're talking about different kinds of creatures, and to attempt to lump one set of controls into a single package and use it to apply to all of them makes no more sense than the Tylenol therapy. The first group we have to deal with are the crazies. Now, the crazies do things for reasons that I don't understand, and I've known them for a long time, known a bunch of them. Never gotten to know one well. I don't understand what they're thinking. John Hinckley is a crazy. John thought the way to get a date with a young Yale student who happened to be a sort of movie star was to shoot the president. He thought that one thing would follow naturally after another. What caused that thinking? No one knows. Certainly the jury was technically right when they said he was nuts. Certainly America was prematurely concerned when they said, oh, he'll get out and do it again. The psychiatrist that signs John Hinckley's release papers, number one, is going to have his name in every national magazine. And number two, if Hinckley hurts anybody, he's going to jail, and he knows it. So I don't think John will be shooting another president in the near future. The Boston Strangler, a serial killer. He killed 13 women, ages 18 to 88, over a period of 18 months, and never got caught. Had he not turned himself in and wanted his identity known, it still wouldn't be known. He would be in jail for other crimes. Because before and after his episode as a strangler in his early to mid-30s, he raped 2,000 women in 3 countries and as many as 5 in 4 states in one day, and was home by 5 o'clock. Some people used to say, you're getting a fee in this case, and I said, no, but I don't care, I'm going to get his diet. Now, I've known a lot of macho people in my life, but to be home by 5 o'clock after 4 states and 5 assaults, you've got to be crazy. What was wrong with Albert? I don't know. We tried to find out. He said, "I can never be let out again. I know I'm a terrible person." If you looked at his childhood, you could understand that. His father taught him to break and enter when he was 5. He was doing his sister in the closet when he was 6. He was an accomplished criminal by the time he was 11. And when he was 7, he used to come home and he'd find his mother on the couch because his father had a prostitute in the bedroom for the evening. Now, if that isn't enough to shape a personality between the ages of 5 and 8, when most personalities do get shaped and most criminals are born, I don't know what is. But what we didn't learn about Albert DeSalvo, the Boston Strangler, and all of his ilk was how to recognize him before he got loose and out of control and began to nail innocent victims. For all the super sleuthing you hear about on television, if the police cannot establish a motive or a nexus between the victim and the assailant, they are almost helpless. And that is why serial killers normally run up a dozen victims before they're caught, and then it's usually a fluke. The normal investigative techniques simply don't apply. If one of you were to go to downtown Richmond and become a sniper and knock off total strangers and had the appropriate equipment, you probably would have a 99-to-1 shot of getting away with it, at least for a while. The crazies don't adapt to our court system. Indeed, sometimes they don't know they were there. I had a prominent crazy some years ago, and the case began this way. We get an awful lot of crazy mail, and there's no way to sort through it all. We get letters every day, usually from an institution, and you can tell those, they've been censored. And they're written on lined paper. Some of them are legible and some are not. But they will propose certain lawsuits, like sue President Reagan for carrying on an affair with Margaret Thatcher, or people of different inclination for carrying on an affair with Francois Mitterrand. Kinds of things, you know, just don't have great promise as an actual lawsuit. They go in the circular file. One day, my secretary came in to me and she said, "I thought you might want to look at this one." And it was a letter on an institutional letterhead from a jail, and it said, "Dear Lee, send me a pack of Pall Malls, George." That was it. Never heard of it. But a month later, I got a letter from a lawyer in Buffalo, New York. He said, "My client, George Fitzsimmons, has been writing you, and he would like to retain your services. He's in a little trouble. He's charged with killing his aunt and uncle. She had 19 stab wounds. He had 21. Both were 85 years old. Neither weighed 100 pounds. George is 6'6" and a Vietnam veteran. And the knife that he was carrying when he was arrested was missing the point, which was found in his uncle's head." This began to shape up as a case of circumstantial evidence that one ought to keep an eye on. And I read on a little further. It said, "By way of background, 5 years ago, George killed his mother and father, each with a single karate chop to the neck. And he was found not guilty by reason of insanity by a judge who said he'd been crazy all of his life. It's a shame he wasn't picked up before he went to Vietnam, which certainly wasn't very good therapy for a crazy young man. And he also said he should never, never be released. He will be a danger as long as he lives." He was 31 at the time. So George was put in a mental institution in New York, and every day the doctors in attendance would see him coming down the halls. The halls weren't very wide, and George was 6'6", and he usually had a foolish grin, and it was impossible to see him in the confines of that area without remembering that he'd killed 2 people with his bare hands in less than 3 seconds a few years before. And as the doctors contemplated the fear associated with that experience on a daily basis, they began to say to themselves, "You know, I think George is getting better." Because people who get better get out. And he said, "I won a case in the institution, and George hired me because he was acquitted technically of killing his mother and father. He inherited their estate, paid my fee. I got him out. All the doctors said there's nothing wrong with George. The objects of his hostilities have been eliminated. So he can be released now." And that's the posture of this case. And by the way, George has $92,000 in the bank. Well, this obviously became a case that cried for legal services of a stalwart nature. So I went shuffling off to Countersport, Pennsylvania, to see George Fitzsimmons, who had become a celebrity in the community. They had never had a murder before in Countersport, Pennsylvania, a sleepy little town just south of the New York border, about midway between east and west. And the sheriff was justifiably proud. He not only had the first murderer in town, but a double murderer. So he gave him the bridal suite of cells and proudly ushered me into that cell and introduced me to George Fitzsimmons. I had been prepared for something a little off-center, But I was taken aback. Here came this big string bean, looking for all the world like he were the Cheshire Cat, and he was carrying a law book under his arm. We're always pleased to meet a new client who has a law book under his arm, particularly when the charge is murder and the law book is about conveyancing real estate, which was the case. And as I contemplated this set of circumstances, I heard a loud clang. And I looked around, and the sheriff had locked me in the cell and was saying, "Call me when you need me." This was not comforting. George had killed 2 and probably 4 people on no known provocation, and it was my thought that he should be handled somewhat gently as a new client. So I said, "Now, George, you know that I'm here to consider taking your case. You're charged with some serious offenses. You have a background for them to prove that you were here. And where were you?" And he said, "I was in Bradford, Pennsylvania. That's 50 miles west." I said, "No, it's 46 miles west. I've been there a number of times. Just tell me who you saw, where you stayed in the hotel, or where you ate, and I'll rush out and get a bunch of affidavits, and we'll just blow this case right out of the water, George, with a good alibi." "Well," he said, "in Bradford, I was very careful not to let anyone know I was there." I said, "George, why don't we pass alibi for the moment? Anything else that sounds like a good notion?" He said, "Well, what about self-defense?" He brightened a little bit. And I said, "George, these 2 people were very elderly, very slight, multiple stab wounds. You didn't have a mark on you. I don't think self-defense is going to fly in this case, frankly. And while we're at it, why don't we pass accident and suicide as well?" Now, I was feeling a little more confident now. He hadn't swung at me, seemed to be getting into the swing of things. I said, "George, I want to be serious. You know you have the attorney-client privilege. Whatever you tell me will remain within the confines of my head unless and until you insist that it be repeated, and I must know something. I can't defend you unless I have an insight into the truth. Did you feel any hostility toward your aunt and uncle?" George became very indignant. He said, "Well, of course not. They were just like a mother and father to me." It's a true story. It's on the court record in Greensburg, Pennsylvania, where George stood trial. 12 days of trial took us 1 year. We had to send him to a mental institution and pump him up with stelazine for 3 weeks to get 1 day of trial out of him. By the end of the day, he would fire the judge, he would fire me, he would fire the court reporters, take the witness stand and tell a new version of the murder. One of the most telling of those versions was that the tree had come in from the yard and picked up the knife and done in his aunt and uncle. Now, what do we know about George Fitzsimmons? Nothing. What are we likely to know? Nothing. The state of Pennsylvania has never run a single study on him. And until, number 1, you're going to spend some money finding out what are the indicators that this crazy person is going to become violent and pick them up in adolescence or soon thereafter, you will have serial killers to bother you. And number 2, you must make the decision that they must be confined not on criminal process but on civil process. That is, until they are better, which with present technology, as to most of them, is terribly unlikely. It's difficult to cure a diseased person when you don't know what the disease is. We have very little to offer you there, but that's only about 2% of the criminal problem in the United States. It gets a lot of ink, of course. California seems to generate 1 a month. The hillside strangler, the zebra killer. They have been much trouble naming them as the people that come up with names for hurricanes in the United States. The second group of people are non-criminals. They populate the rolls of the criminal courts on a steady, predictable but unpredictable basis. We know how many there will be in a given year. We don't know who they're going to be. These are all fraternal or in-house acts of violence. The Latin word for it, the one that lawyers learn when they're in law school and never use again, is uxoricide. It's the killing of spice, which is the plural of spouse. A husband kills the wife kills the husband. Occasionally some of the children get messed up. Generally, these are the product of frustration that can no longer be contained. There is a virtual explosion of personalities within the house, and somebody gets extremely violent. In some more sanguine states, it's called short-form divorce. It is thought that it is more expedient in the end to knock off your spouse and hire me than it is to go through a divorce, which can be extremely painful. Now, the bad news is it's almost impossible to stop this kind of criminal conduct. In order to do that, one would literally have to station a policeman in every bedroom where the trouble usually begins, and another in every kitchen where the weapons are usually found, And I don't think even this Supreme Court would go for that, although Justice Rehnquist would vote for it, without question. The good news is, unless you happen to be over for cocktails and don't leave judiciously when you see things going to pieces, it's not likely to hurt you. If you can stay out of the crossfire, this is a contained kind of violence that doesn't visit itself except on those who are closely linked. The kind of crime that bothers people, whether you're going to shop in Manhattan and wonder whether you really dare be on the streets after 9 o'clock, my advice is don't, or whether you can afford to go to a movie without being held up, even in your own hometown, or whether somebody's going to break into your home, or rob your bank if you work there, or sell out his public office if you vote for it, have one thing in common. That is, they are business-oriented, they are governed by a form of logic, and they depend upon the risk against reward syndrome, which governs almost everybody doing anything in the normal course of life. If you run a business, you won't expand it, add more employees, develop a new strategy, or bring out a new product unless you think that the odds are that the rewards involved will outweigh the risks of investment, retraining, startup costs, etc. By the same token, a youngster who's going to hold up a 7-Eleven, a gas station, or a liquor store, someone who's been caught doing that, and in our infinite wisdom has been to a college of criminal knowledge, which we call a prison, where he can associate only with those who know something about better kinds of crimes, that is, in terms of result and reward, will hold up a bank or rob a person in the street if they think they have any money. Those that are in the nonviolent sector will take bribes, as we all saw in Abscam, to influence their public thinking. And at the top end of the scale, you have, of course, the drug enterprise, which is created by the United States, for the United States, and against the United States, through its total lack of wisdom. And we'll get to that in a minute. Now, obviously, the youngster who picks up a loaded pistol and goes to rob a convenience store doesn't intend to shoot anybody over a couple, $300, which is what he may expect to find in the register. But most of these people are sociopaths. Sociopaths tend to be very cowardly, and the first time they get nervous, they reach for the edge, a weapon if they have one. A sociopath is distinguished from all you normal folks in this fashion. If you are watching a new Mercedes coupe swoop down the interstate, and you say to yourself, gee, I hope when I graduate from here, I can get myself a good position, get increases in pay, put some money away, then I'll be able to do the down payment and handle the monthlies, I'm going to get one of those Mercedes. Sociopath says, I want one now. And the fact that I am unemployed is irrelevant. And he'll proceed to either steal the car or the money necessary to obtain it. The sociopath can live next door to you, throw garbage on your lawn, and sue you for contributing to an untidy neighborhood and never miss a beat of his heart. He can cause you the greatest pain and even death and feel no regrets. The most classic sociopath I ever examined on a witness stand was Jimmy the Weasel Fratianno, who wrote a book. The United States government helped him publish it. He became a government witness. He made a lot of money out of it, called The Last Mafioso. Jimmy had killed 2 of his friends in his youth on orders from the mafia by strangling them to death, which is rather messy. Of course, he made sure somebody else was holding them before he did that. Jimmy was not very big and certainly not very brave. When I cross-examined him, I said, well, after you knocked off your 2 friends, I realized you were reluctant to do that, being a good citizen, but had to carry out your orders. Did you go to a restaurant? He said, yeah, you went and had a little pasta. Did you have a good night's sleep after that? Certainly, why not? He didn't understand the question. That is a classic sociopath. He never missed a beat. Generally, these people are not frightened by tall sentences. In certain kinds of crimes, they see the risk increase substantially, and then their conduct may be influenced. They envision crimes of crescendo. A crime of crescendo is like any other exciting act. If you're going to rob a bank, you're at risk for about 55 seconds. If you're not out in 55 seconds, and you have any kind of modern bank to contend with, the curve that suggests that you'll be apprehended before you get very far from the scene goes almost straight up. On the other hand, if you do get out in time, the curve that suggests you won't be apprehended at all, at least not for a while, goes almost straight down. So the criminal sees this as a crisis, plans for it, gets his adrenaline up for it, then it's done. And in less than a minute, either gets away with it or doesn't, and frankly, about 8 out of 9 or 8 out of 10 get away with bank robbery, at least the first go-round. Another gimmick that used to be popular, has tailed off lately, is to kidnap the president of the bank, send another team in to hold his family, take him to the bank, give him a couple of laundry bags and say, friend, unless these come out with you full of $100 bills and no commotion, you'll never see your family again. But if they do, I'm going to take you for a ride, and then you might see them again. Those are your choices. That was effective for a while, provided you had the kinds of people that weren't bothered by doing that. There are many in this country. I'm sure that those of you who remember any of the vestiges of Watergate thought, as some did, and again, it is the naivete of America, that following these terrible revelations showing that corruption had reached its ugly fingers even into the seat of power in the White House, there would be a general catharsis that would sweep America, and we would all turn toward a moralistic view of things, and public officials would eschew anything in violation of their sworn oaths as public officials. It was only a few years before we were all treated to the television escapades of the congressmen who were involved in abscam. Now, these fellows were taken into rather lush surroundings, introduced to an Italian FBI agent from Fort Lauderdale who, with a little makeup and a turban, was posing as a gentleman from the Middle East who was badly in need of favors and could afford to pay for it. Each one agreed to do things that were totally illegal, and in exchange was given an envelope. And the envelope was $5,000, $50,000 in hundreds, kind of standard. When I started out, you could bribe a high public official for $10,000. Inflation has gotten a hold of that. By the mid-'70s, it was $50K, just to do that sort of thing. And then, of course, we come to our friends who push the drugs. Now, here is one of the saddest episodes, it seems to me, in the history of the past 20 years of the United States. Most of you will not recall, but back in the 50s, marijuana was thought to be a loco weed. It was thought that if you took a couple of puffs on a joint, you would wind up smashing your car into the next roundabout, as the British call them, or rotary, or tree, that you couldn't get around. It completely dissembled. When Robert Mitchum, in the late 50s, was found to have a single marijuana cigarette, the best that a very prominent lawyer could get for him was 30 days in jail. After I began to practice, it was faddish to arrest all the college students the local police could get and charge them with having a marijuana cigarette. And each day, class attendance would be miserable because everybody would be down at criminal court with his lawyer pleading guilty to possession of marijuana. Then the families began to upset. They didn't like that. They said, hey, I'm getting a kid, I'm paying $10,000 a year to get him a college degree, and he's also got a conviction for a felony. And so, after a lot of public disapproval at that level, 13 states eventually decriminalized marijuana. So it's not a crime to have it, but you can pay a $100 fine if you get caught. Alaska, being so far from Florida that its supply routes were poor, went a little further and said you can grow it as long as you don't sell it. Well, the people of Alaska were not to be denied. After all, fair is fair. Then cocaine became the jet-setter's drug. And at the same time we were telling ourselves, well, marijuana doesn't really do any harm, the same story got sold in cocaine. It promoted a euphoric high, thought to be in some cases a little stronger than marijuana. The price shot up dramatically. People dug up the fact that Coca-Cola used to have some in it before 1904, when it became illegal except by prescription. And everybody had a sneaking admiration for the top-run guys who had all the dough, who always had a few lines of Coke at every party. Indeed, it would be most unfashionable to go to a party and complain about that. You would be disinvited by the clan for the next 6 months. And it got a tremendous toehold. Somewhere along the line, somebody discovered that when you have a substance that is terribly cheap to get, it commands a huge price in the marketplace, and the market is strong, it would be profitable to transport it from A to B and collect the difference. And indeed, the economics were encouraging. $250 worth of cocoa leaves from the Andes Mountains in Peru, when properly boiled down and treated, could net out, cut to 12.5% pure, $800,000 worth of cocaine on the street. If you are taking a business course and you have difficulty in figuring how to scrape a profit out of that kind of margin between cost of goods sold and retail sales price, you should shift immediately to something more esoteric. But the smugglers did not. They began to appear in droves. Now, at this point, one might have thought that the United States would be capable of looking at its own history. Anytime you tell the general public that which you want you cannot have, whether it be Japanese automobiles, German cameras, alcohol, or marijuana, you are in for a problem. That is what supports smuggling, the movement of contraband. When Americans couldn't own gold, we had to defend a few people each year for owning gold. Now you can all have gold. We don't defend anybody anymore. When Americans pretended in 1920 that drinking was evil, they would stop drinking. And all they did was pretend. The amount of liquor consumed in the United States probably never diminished. The manner in which it got here changed rather dramatically. In that case, we were surrounded by people of a different mind. And the rum runners were kind of heroes. There was, again, a sneaking admiration for the guy with a high-powered speedboat that would come across the Great Lakes from Canada, or run the border in a Jeep from Mexico, or come shooting in some kind of vehicle from Bermuda, the Bahamas, and all the other places that continued to manufacture liquor and perfectly happy to sell it to us at inflated prices. For 13 years, the charade kept up. Finally, December 5th of 1933, only a few months after I was born, and I hope there's a connection there, but I could never prove it, Prohibition was repealed. Okay? Meanwhile, we had created Al Capone, given organized crime the first big foothold in the United States as an organization, and although we got rid of Prohibition, we didn't get rid of Al. He simply went into other businesses, as did his compadres. Now, in 1986, 53 years later, we are finally, if you read the newspapers, catching up with that organization, but we've paid a tremendous price. Why didn't it work? Certainly it didn't work. It created more corruption among public officials, including judges, police, prosecutors, and so forth. There was just too much money. Anytime you give a people that is used to a certain kind of income and a hope for a certain kind of income money by breaking a law to which they're not sympathetic for very little work, you are guaranteeing that you will corrupt people at every level, and I don't mean just those in public office. Everybody who went into a speakeasy was breaking the law, just as everybody who smokes a marijuana cigarette in all but 13 states is breaking the law, but there is a policy not to punish them. There are simply too many. And politically, it's unacceptable to irritate that many people, particularly around election time. The federal government has a policy not to prosecute for small amounts of cocaine unless they don't like you. Then they may selectively dig you out, but generally they won't touch a case unless there's a quantity worthy of distribution of cocaine and an even greater amount of marijuana, and they frankly they prefer not to deal with marijuana because cocaine gives bigger headlines, and that's really all law enforcement is getting. We are right back now in Prohibition. There was a segment that didn't like alcohol. They whipped people up to the point where they got a majority vote to prohibit it, but nobody really meant it. In retrospect, it's like the guy who quit smoking for a day. It's a hell of a good idea the first day. At the end of 24 hours, it becomes more difficult, and so on down the line. And so we kid ourselves. We now have a greater criminal enterprise than Prohibition ever thought of fostering. The greatest business in the United States today is smuggling drugs. Everybody's excited about it, and a lot more people pretend to be than really are. The Congress is excited about it, but I noticed they weren't that excited 6 months ago, even though the quantity and the method of doing business has not changed in 6 months, a year, or more. President Reagan has been adamantly opposed to drugs and said that he will tolerate no compromise, and he created the Bush Task Force to go to South Florida and put together a coalition of law enforcement agencies in order to stamp out the most prolific source of drugs crossing the border in the United States, which is that long peninsula with all of its bayous and ungovernable shores called the state of Florida and its adjacent states, South Carolina, Georgia, etc. What was the product? Well, there was a great fanfare. I was down there at the time. Announcements were made. Penalties were up. People who got caught were going to get more time for bringing in a distributable quantity of a controlled substance, as it's called, than for murder. And that turned out to be true. The average guy in Florida commits a murder is out in 7 years. For this stuff, you can do 20, 25, even on a first offense. The thought was it might scare somebody. They did catch a few people. We have to estimate continually, but it looks like in their best moments, they were between 3% and 8% of those coming across the border. That becomes irrelevant and totally irrelevant. If you're to logically examine the success of a criminal enterprise, there's only one index that you can use. What is the price of the contraband today? If interdiction is working, the price skyrockets. If a glut is coming to the market just like oil, it drops. During the first 12 months of the efforts of the Bush task force, the street price of a kilo of pure cocaine dropped from $62,000 a kilo to $18,000. So many people had heard about this wonderful business from all the publicity that was given to it by the Bush task force that there were simply a lot more smugglers out there. And it is not very difficult to run the border. The rewards are ridiculous. I once defended a man who was 35 years old, never been in trouble in his life, had a good job, making $38,000 a year, a member of the PTA, respected in the community, owned his own home, had a pretty nice car, and finally somebody squealed on him after they get caught, which is how most of these fellows take a fall. There's not too much sleuthing in this business either. And I said, Enrico, why did you do this? Well, he said, first of all, for 4 hours' work unloading a shrimp boat of marijuana bales and putting them in the truck, I got paid $25,000. He said, I was behind in my debts and I wasn't being able to whittle them down. I didn't want to have to embarrass my family by saying we're going to sell the car and take the kids out of private school, so I thought I'd do it just once. And then after that, I did it another time. If he hadn't done it the second time, I suppose he couldn't have hired counsel. Now, he got 6 years in prison for that. 6 years. But $25,000 in 4 hours, how many people do you think you can recruit who are working 40 hours a week for $400 or $500 a week on that basis, particularly if they're under financial pressure, as many parts of Florida were during that era? It is a totally unmanageable by any kind of education. You can educate the users, but that hasn't been working. There are a lot of users out there. But you don't educate the smugglers. The smugglers are half criminals, sophisticated criminals. They generally run the business and provide the bank, but the runners are apt to be a Tom, Dick, and Harry who just wanted to make a lot of money in a hurry, and prior to that really didn't have any known criminal propensities. The money that is shoved in the hands of police officers and others is awful. In the last 4 years, we've caught a judge who was flying his own private airplane with marijuana in from the Bahamas. That's a state judge from Kentucky. 3 federal prosecutors had to resign from office for handling cocaine on a personal basis in Atlanta, Georgia, and the story is the same all over. Well, I agree with the notion if something is working, don't break your neck to fix it. When something is not working, something constructive ought to be done. And the question is, can anything be done? The obvious answer is, well, we may have to do what we did with alcohol. We'll make it legal, we'll tax it, we'll regulate it, and at least we'll know who's coming to buy something. That isn't the only remedy. There are 2 fundamental problems. First of all, we have treated legally marijuana, which is probably more innocuous than coffee, tea, salt, and certainly cigarettes and alcohol in terms of any damage to the human being. And cocaine, which is much more damaging. It not only has destroyed careers, but recently has been killing young athletes and gotten our attention. To heroin, which is probably the deadliest drug on the street. A perfectly normal human being who becomes a heroin addict will become homicidal within as little as a month. Because instead of just getting a high from heroin, it lets you down into the gutter, and the only way to come back up to normal again for a few hours is to get another fix. And people have been known to kill their own family members to steal enough money to buy another fix. If the penalties are the same, and unfortunately they are the smugglers going to opt to bring in bales of marijuana, which are big and smelly and difficult to handle and the kind of thing that trained dogs can find, kilos of cocaine, which come in a football-sized container made famous by John DeLorean in his trial, or heroin? Well, it's very simple. The price of marijuana is dirt cheap compared to the other 2. Cocaine is now running $27,500 a kilo of pure in Miami, and heroin is holding at $150,000. If you're going to get the same punishment, what makes the more business sense to use as a commodity? There's a solid market for all. The second problem is that except for crimes of possession, when you are at risk every moment, criminals think of crises as moments that will pass. They do not envision being caught. They think that if caught, because they're not well educated or well informed, they can hire a lawyer for a lot of money, which they'll then have, and he can fly in the face of the most devastating evidence and get them acquitted, or they'll get off in a technicality, or they can stay on bond during appeal and run away. Except that most people learn, Robert Vesco included, who was at the last stop in Cuba, that from the U.S. there aren't many places to run, particularly if you wanted on a dope offense. There has to be some rethinking. Assuming that there will be no compromise, and while this president is in office, don't waste any efforts trying to lobby for legalization of anything unless you've got 2/3 of the Congress solidly behind you, which you don't, because he will veto anything that even smells like tolerance of any controlled substance. But drugs are not our only problem. They are just the most prominent. They probably cause the most damage of any single element of criminal activity, and they get the most ink, as people like to say, because we're seeing drug busts all over the country, but particularly around the shores of the United States, where most of the hard stuff at least comes aboard. We grow a little marijuana, we don't grow many cocoa leaves or many opium poppies in the United States. A little bit of analysis would ask, is there anything that is a common denominator between these different kinds of criminals who all have one objective: to make money and put it in their pockets? They're not crazy and they're not mad at their wives. They want to make a buck and they don't want to work for it. Because if there is, maybe there's a way to get at the problem. If I were suddenly placed in Secretary Weinberger's shoes and made the Secretary of Defense and charged essentially with protecting the United States against any superpower that might decide they'd like a little of our real estate and our other good things, and I had a genie appear out of a bottle who could grant just one wish, I would say, give me the power to eliminate instantly all fuel in the enemy's supplies. And then there is no conflict, there are no weapons, there is nothing. No bullet can move without a fuel propellant, no airplane can leave the ground, no rocket can leave its silo, no tank can thunder over the countryside. Everything must be propelled by something more than a manpower. Even fighting on horses is no longer thought to be very effective. So if we can knock out their fuel supplies, you say, yes, we can rest easy and stop throwing billions each year into protecting ourselves against a war we say we're preventing by threatening what we'll do if the other side strikes first. Well, there is no genie, and therefore we continue to arm ourselves. But there is a fuel supply, in a sense, in crime. View it as the Achilles heel, if you like, the carotid artery, the jugular vein, makes no difference. It is a place where a strike could be made that would have more impact on criminal conduct in the United States than any combination of 12 other things you could conjure up and execute if I gave you all the money in the world and the White House and the Congress as your power seats for 6 months to get in business. Because human nature is human nature. If you all wait around until everybody turns and decides, gee, it'd be much nicer to be a good guy than a bad guy, you have a very long wait. You must understand that sociopaths don't feel bad about being bad guys, and they will continue to. 75% of all prison inmates are sociopaths. 70% of the ones we let out go back. They will not learn anything. A few may go through a Christian conversion. Not all of those are to be believed. Some wind up back in jail, and it's not a big enough percentage to lead toward any mass remedy. But there is a common denominator. Some years ago, it would have been most inconvenient to deny its use to honest people. Not so today. It is cash money. Cash is the fuel of the criminal and of almost no use to an honest American. We have become, not because George Orwell ordained it, but because we have chosen to become a society that is on computer, carries enough plastic to make your pocket sag, has charge accounts everywhere. Those who are students and may not have moved into that world don't have enough cash to make any difference, most of them. But criminals must have it. Anytime you see a pile of cash on a table, somebody is up to no good. Be assured of that. Anytime I see the prosecution get a pile of cash taken from my client into a criminal case, I am already busily exploring pleas of guilty. The jury knows he's a bad guy. Otherwise, why would he have it? 15 years ago, we could sell the notion that the crash of '29 scared me out of a bank, therefore I keep my money in a shoebox or in the bedpost or in a jar in the backyard. That doesn't sell anymore. Don't even waste your breath selling that to jury. Now, just supposing there were a federal statute, and it would have to be federal. No state can intrude upon the commercial nature of our currency. That it were a felony. That means a serious crime that can impede you for the rest of your life, or for at least 10 or 15 years if you get convicted of one. A felony to possess in excess of a certain amount of cash at any one time. Not only to possess, but to tender in payment of any debt or receive in payment of any obligation. Let's just fix the number at 1,000. With a subsection that said, and that would be a 5-year offense, by the way, 2 years minimum service, no games, no paroles. Mandatory jail sentences for offenses of possession where there is no crescendo. You are at risk every moment, day and night, when you have possession, whether it be direct or constructive, of that contraband. People do stop and think about that, particularly the non-criminals, but criminals as well. Crimes of possession have shown some deterrent effect. States that have put in laws that say you must go to jail for a year if you get caught with a firearm. Massachusetts was the first one we saw a change in the criminal population. They would hire someone else to bring the gun to the bank, because as felons they automatically got 2 or 3 times the sentence, and they simply wanted to minimize that ongoing risk. Supposing for a felon under this statute, we provide that the amount you may carry is half, $500, period, and the punishment is double, just so that you understand you're the people we're really looking for anyway. And the habit of using cash among those who still have it. And in honest people, you don't find many people with $1,000 in their pocket unless they're going to or coming from Las Vegas, and coming from only if they were lucky, or Atlantic City, or the track, or wherever. It's just not the American habit to do that. It's dirty. In Florida, almost all of it has been infiltrated with cocaine. It used to be the cops would say, and we found the defendant had money in his pocket with traces of cocaine, until it turned out that all the money had traces of cocaine. The bankers, everybody else. It just circulated so much. Now let's look at all our bad guys again. How many youngsters who truly believe that they're more likely to get credit card slips out of the cash register of the liquor store are going to go in with a pistol? Where's the risk and reward now? How many bank robbers will, for 55 seconds after expensive and very dangerous preparations and execution, want to stand in a bank watching a computer whir while it transfers money by wire? Not a lot. How many abscam congressmen would have taken a personal check, or a certified check, or the imprint from a MasterCard? Not many. How many muggers in New York City would knock a woman to the street and grab her purse at night if they knew it was very unlikely she had anything in there more than a few dollars, because the habit was gone, because literally we had made contraband that which, although desirable principally for dishonest reasons, was still perfectly legal. The only thing you can't do with money right now is carry 10,000 in or out of the country without filling out a cash transaction report, or put 10,000 into a bank or take it out without doing the same. And criminals all over the place will make $10,000, $9,000 transactions every day just to bank their money. It isn't enough. How would the drug trade operate? This is probably the greatest benefit of all. The drug trade now operates because people on the street with 10s and 20s and so forth, where they're buying a few joints for $20 or $50, or cocaine at $100 a gram, which is a going rate in most metropolitan areas, or heroin for more, have to pay in cash. These retailers on the street then have to go to the next level with cash to get more in large amounts, and so forth on up to the suppliers coming in across the borders. Never in my life in the practice of law had I seen $1 million in a bag before the dope kings began to emerge, due solely to our mishandling of the smuggling problem, which parallels prohibition so severely that people all over the world are laughing at us that we have not seen the common denominators and tried to learn something from the last failure. One day I saw $1,800,000 in a suitcase. That particular group of criminals would have more trouble functioning than any other if they had these new problems. First, maintaining the cash has become a crime of possession. It doesn't make any difference whether it's in your closet, your safe deposit box, or wherever. If it is within your care, custody, and control, even constructively, you own it. If it's more than $500 and you're a criminal, you pick up 4 years. Automatic, no defense, no legal chicanery to be played with that particular charge. Second, where do you find it? If you're a person who steals cash for a living, where do you go to get it? It becomes a difficult problem. Third, what do you do with it? 5 years ago, you could walk into any yacht broker in Florida and give him $500,000 in cash and walk away with a 70-footer because there was nothing wrong with that, technically. But if it becomes a felony for him to receive that much money over $1,000, that won't be possible anymore. Anyone who tries to spend a large amount of money, even if he somehow lays his hands on it, will be so conspicuous that the tipsters who for 10% will call the IRS, the FBI, or whoever will light up the phone lines. Crime, like everything else, cannot be halted in its tracks. You have to put it in a down cycle that feeds on itself. This is true of disease. When we go after cancer, we first have to use chemotherapy, which is poisoning the blood, hoping you poison the tumor before you poison the patient. It's a very raw way to treat a disease. And then, if we bring that tumor in line, we can start using interferon, which will generate defense mechanisms within the body, and it can carry on its own fight without the horrors of chemotherapy. But the cycle has begun. If you don't put crime in a cycle by hitting it right squarely where it lives, and it lives, and it lives only on money, cash money, very little white-collar crime or computer crime compares statistically with crimes for cash money. If you can make that a difficult thing to do, extremely difficult, and a much more risky thing to do, you'll begin to make some inroads, because, ladies and gentlemen, some of these people are very stupid, others are quite intelligent and very shrewd. Many were brought up on the street. They can read you at 100 yards and figure you out quicker than you could figure them out if you knew them for a day. But they're not crazy. The crazies are over in that category. And there's a point at which they'll say, okay, enough's enough. It just isn't worth it. Either too many people are getting caught, or I'm in such a state of tension all the time because I've got to have this stuff, and if they find it out of my cabin, they're going to find out I own the cabin, and boom, I'm gone. You demotivate. The only way to turn the course of human conduct, the only known way in history that has ever worked other than brute strength, that is literally shooting on sight everybody with any amount of any drug. And although the Congress is tweaking the idea, I don't think we're there yet. Unless you do that, which is what they would do in Saudi Arabia. In Saudi Arabia, on the Friday following the crime, after what you would call a very brief trial, they remove the offending part. If you steal, one hand. If you kill, one head. Rape is not a popular crime in Saudi Arabia. I was in Jeddah one time and saw an executive get 15 years for having a case of liquor. There is no parole in Saudi Arabia, and you wouldn't like their prisons. Now, if you want to give up the entire Constitution and move that swiftly, yes, pure punishment may be a deterrent, but you're not going to live long enough to see that. Yank the rug out. Take the airplane out from under the pilot. Get the fuel out of the system, and there is a prayer. Politically, is that doable? Generally, no. In 1987 and 1988, just maybe, and here's why. In order to sponsor such a bill, you have to commit political suicide. The so-called honest people who are going to be killed by this. Supposing you got 50 grand in the bank, cheated IRS for it, never declared it. Now there's a law, if you got more than $1,000 in your safe deposit box, you get 2 years. You can either burn it or turn it in. When you turn it in, there'll be more federal agencies asking you questions than you can dream up. How many campaign contributors? I know an awful lot of cash shows up at campaign time, believe me. My firm once got paid, I'm convinced, out of the White House safe, $350,000 that Nixon was keeping as a slush fund. We defended James McCord, along with your friend G. Gordon Liddy. All that money's got to be turned in or somebody's got to go to jail. Is that going to be a popular law? No. What politician will know who he's offending? The guys with the cash don't run up and say that. They simply don't give you any money if you support that bill. So, you need a president who is generically honest. Mr. Reagan certainly qualifies. Who is determined of purpose, even bullheaded. He qualifies there too. And who is not afraid to go directly to the people and say, if Congress disagrees with me, I am talking to the voters. You call your congressman and tell him, do this. Had he not done that, you never would have had a tax cut to believe with, because on an economic basis, it couldn't sell in anybody's classroom. But he got it. Now, he can't make any waves when he's out trying to get Paula Hawkins and some other people to hold their Republican seats, so he's got some clout during his last 2 years in office ever. But when that is over, he doesn't have to please a single voter for as long as he lives. If he would decide to spearhead, not just support, but spearhead such a bill, the logical analysis of its probable success is so overwhelming that in all probability, people who opposed it or were encouraged to oppose it in the halls of Congress would have a lot of trouble standing up and saying exactly why they opposed it. Because the inconvenience to all the people in this room of not being allowed to carry $1,000 or more in cash, I don't think it's very noticeable. The criminal population is devastating. Not since Dwight Eisenhower have we had a president poised exactly like this, who is from a conservative, get tough on crime at any price idea. I mean, who last had an attorney general who said publicly, we really don't need courts. If the FBI arrests you, that means you're guilty. We could end it right there. Only Brother Meese, okay? Will he do it? I don't know. I don't know. If he doesn't, I doubt that in my lifetime the combination will hit again. A very popular, strong-willed, two-term president in the last 2 years of his office. I can only tell you some thought has been given to it. If you expect relief to come from any other direction, for any other group of remedies, any other package of legislation, let me tell you, as someone who understands the criminal mind at least better than anyone in this room and probably in this city, it isn't going to work. It's been tried and it hasn't worked. When England had capital punishment for 127 different crimes, one of them was picking pockets. It was notoriously known that pickpockets had their best days at public hangings when everyone was transfixed, waiting for the trapdoor to drop so they could watch a human being die they never felt their wallet slipping out. Now, if that was a deterrent, it didn't reach to pickpockets. One final word, and then we'll take some questions. Many of the people that I wind up defending have walked into the office and say, you know, I always hoped to meet you socially. I thought that would be fun, but never like this. Never like this. Some never intended to get in criminal trouble and didn't do anything wrong. The system just bolted against them. That happens occasionally. Some never intended to get in criminal trouble, but they got involved with a scheme which was honest at first and it got away from them. And pretty soon, in trying to contain it, they crossed the line several times. And very frequently, particularly when they're contemporaries, I am moved to recollect what was said to my graduating class by the dean of the law school, who was by far the senior man aboard, had a lot of experience, and was still a practicing lawyer. He had some street sense. And we were very unhappy that day. Carroll Chessman, who had not committed a murder, the red light bandit of California, who had fought valiantly for 12 years because there was no record of his trial and he couldn't get an appeal, was finally executed by Governor Pat Brown, and all of us flaming liberal at that time law students were incensed that this could happen. It seemed to be a political decision responding to a bare majority of California's feelings and very little to do with justice. we were in a sour mood. But I was listening because every time this fellow opened his mouth all the way through school, it was well worth the time it took to hear what he had to say. He said, gentlemen and ladies, there were only 2 ladies back then, you're about to become, some of you, lawyers. As lawyers, you will be invited, because it is thought that not only do you know where the line is between legal and illegal, but you also know the best way to step across it and get back. You will be invited, sometimes at unconscionable fees, to deliver a case of scotch to the chief of police in the hope that a certain traffic ticket will be squelched, to do some extraordinary favors for the Board of Assessors in the hope that a prominent citizen's tax bill will be reduced instead of increased as it should be, and so on down the line. I only want to tell you that if you are successful in life, something we all discover much later, because you in your 20s can't really see beyond the age of 40 now. You probably think you'll be dead by then. What's nice to find that you've done is, number 1, to achieve something meaningful, to become good at what you do, whatever that may be. Number 2, to get some recognition from the community. They say, oh boy, he's a hell of a broker, or whatever it is that he undertakes to do. 3, to put something back into the community. If somebody helped you get through college with a loan, look around and find some deserving youngster who could use that kind of help and without it might never get a break. And 4th, to have enough money to be comfortable. To have maybe a couple cars, know that you can put your own youngsters through college and maybe a couple of poor relatives if that's necessary. Live in a nice house, maybe have a summer place, a boat, some other toys. If you work hard as lawyers, you can achieve every one of those 4 things, as people can in every walk of life. The greatest tragedy is, and I hate to tell you, but I'm talking to this graduating class of 127 people, the greatest tragedy is that a number of you, and not just a handful, are going to wind up at 50 with nothing but the money. Thank you very much.